The dust was a living thing. It coated the tongue, gritted between the teeth, and settled in a fine ochre shroud over everything Caleb owned, which was not much. It covered the raw timber of the unpainted buildings that lined Prosperity's single, sorry excuse for a street, and it hazed the horizon, turning the distant, saw-toothed mountains into a bruised purple memory. The sun was a merciless hammer in a brassy sky, beating down on the land until the air itself shimmered, creating mirages of cool, clear water where there was only cracked earth and the stubborn hope of sagebrush. Silence was the valley's natural state, a profound and weighty quiet broken only by the buzz of a horsefly or the creak of a leather harness. It was a silence Caleb had cultivated, a fortress he had built around himself brick by silent brick. Caleb Holt was a man carved from the same hard materials as the land he worked. His face was a road map of every hardship, the lines around his eyes etched by a sun that gave no quarter, the set of his jaw a testament to a stubbornness that bordered on grim foolishness. He moved with the slow, deliberate economy of a man who never wasted a motion or a word, his large, calloused hands as comfortable with the heft of an axe as they were with the delicate task of suturing a wound on a calf. He had come to this valley to lose himself, to bury the man he had been under acres of rock and toil. His ranch was a lonely bastion against a world that had taken too much, a place where the only demands were those of the seasons, and the only company was the lowing of his cattle and the ghost of his younger brother, Ethan. It was Ethan's memory that had driven him into this isolation, a grief so sharp and private it had left no room for anyone else. The twice-monthly supply run into Prosperity was a necessary torment. He hated the noise, the smells of stale beer and cheap perfume that seeped from the saloon, and the prying eyes of the townsfolk who saw him as a curiosity, the hermit of Bitter Creek. He guided his wagon to the hitching rail in front of the general store, the wood groaning in protest. The air smelled of baked earth, horse manure, and the faint, tantalizing scent of fresh bread from the baker's oven, a smell that reminded him of a life he no longer lived. He was halfway through loading sacks of flour and beans when the sound of the approaching stagecoach cut through the afternoon stupor. It was a plume of dust in the distance long before it was a vehicle, a harbinger of mail and news and, more often than not, trouble. Caleb paid it no mind. It had nothing to do with him. The stage pulled up in a jangle of harnesses and a wheeze of tired horses. A few passengers disembarked, dusty and weary travelers swallowed by the town's indifference. Then the final passenger stepped down, and the entire street seemed to fall silent. She was a splash of impossible color in a world of brown and gray. A woman, small and slender, dressed in a gown of deep crimson silk embroidered with golden phoenixes. The dress was a work of art, a thing of impossible delicacy that had no place in this grit-choked world. Her hair was a glossy black river, coiled in an intricate knot and pierced with a single pin of polished jade. Her face was pale, her features fine and still, her dark eyes taking in the raw, sun-bleached town with an unreadable expression. She was Chinese, and in a place like Prosperity that made her as alien as a creature from the moon. She stood beside a single, small trunk, a solitary island of crimson in a sea of dust. Caleb finished tying down his canvas and turned to go into the store. He felt the storekeeper's gaze on him, then on the woman. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He ignored it. It was not his business. But as he stepped onto the boardwalk, the woman looked directly at him. There was no plea in her eyes, no fear, just a quiet, unnerving stillness. She held a piece of paper in her hand. The storekeeper, a portly man named Miller with a nervous habit of wiping his hands on his apron, scurried out. He pointed a thick finger at Caleb. "That's him," Miller said, his voice a little too loud. "That's Holt." The woman walked toward him, her movements graceful and deliberate despite the way her silk slippers sank into the thick dust. She stopped a few feet away and bowed her head slightly, a gesture so foreign and formal it made Caleb's skin prickle. She held out the paper. Caleb stared at it, then at her, his mind a cold, blank slate. He did not take it. "I am May," she said. Her voice was soft, but it carried in the silence, her words precise and accented. "I am for Ethan Holt." The name hit Caleb like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Ethan, his brother's name, spoken by this impossible woman in a silk dress. He finally took the paper. It was a letter, the stationery brittle and faded. The handwriting was Ethan's, a familiar, optimistic scrawl that twisted something sharp in Caleb's chest. It was a letter to a matchmaker in a coastal city, a contract. It described his brother's land, his prospects, his desire for a wife to build a life with. It was dated 6 months ago. 6 months. Ethan had been dead for 5. The letter must have been delayed, lost, and then found, making its slow, inexorable way across the country long after the man who wrote it had turned to dust himself. Caleb looked from the letter to the woman, May. She was waiting for a man who was gone, a home that existed only in a dead man's dreams, a future that had been buried on a windswept hill. All the frustration of his lonely, grinding life, all the raw, unhealed grief for his brother, coalesced into a single, cold point of anger. It was not her fault. He knew that on some rational level, but standing there, she was the embodiment of another complication, another person, another demand on a life he had stripped bare for a reason. "He's gone," Caleb said. The words were stones in his mouth, blunt and heavy. "Ethan's dead." He watched for her reaction. A flicker of shock, perhaps, confusion, but her expression remained serene, a mask of calm dignity. Her gaze did not waver. It was as if she had expected bad news, had braced herself for the worst the world could offer, and this was simply another form of it. The lack of a visible emotional response unnerved him more than tears would have. "There's no place for you here," he continued, his voice rough. "The stage leaves in the morning. I'll give the driver coin to take you back." He turned his back on her, a clear, brutal dismissal. He strode into the general store, the bell above the door jangling violently. He could feel her standing there, a silent crimson accusation in the middle of the dusty street. He had delivered the hard truth. He had offered a practical solution. His obligation was done. But as he stood at the counter, the scent of cinnamon and cured leather filling his nostrils, he knew, with a sinking certainty, that it was not going to be that simple. The fortress he had built around himself had just been breached, not by an army, but by a quiet woman in a wedding dress who had come looking for a ghost. The sky, which had been a sheet of flawless, searing blue, began to curdle at the edges. By the time Caleb emerged from the store with the last of his supplies, the distant mountains had vanished behind a bruised, churning wall of cloud. The wind had picked up, a low moan that kicked dust devils into a frantic dance down the street. It carried the scent of rain, a smell so rare and precious it usually brought a sense of relief, but today it felt like a closing door. The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth, was already securing his horses. "Ain't going nowhere in this, Holt," the driver grunted, nodding at the approaching storm. "Gully washers'll take out the pass. Be a week, maybe more, 'fore I can get through." Caleb's jaw tightened. A week. He looked over at the woman, May. She had not moved. She stood by her trunk as if rooted to the spot, the wind whipping the fine silk of her dress around her legs. She had nowhere to go. The town's only hotel was little more than a collection of flea-bitten rooms above the saloon. No place for a woman alone, especially one who looked like her. The other townsfolk were already shuttering their windows, their curiosity replaced by the pressing need to prepare. They offered no help, their faces closed and suspicious. She was an outsider. She was his problem. A cold, fat drop of rain splattered against his cheek. Then another. He let out a breath, a ragged sigh of defeat. There was no choice, and he hated it. He hated the obligation, the disruption she represented. He stalked over to her, his boots loud on the boardwalk. "The stage is staying," he said, not looking at her directly, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "You'll come with me." It was not a request. He loaded her small trunk onto the back of the wagon, its lacquered wood and brass fittings a stark contrast to his own rough-sawn supply crates. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, his hand briefly touching hers. Her skin was cool and smooth, her hand surprisingly small in his rough grasp. The contact was brief, impersonal, but it felt like a brand. They rode out of town in the silence as the first sheets of rain began to fall, turning the dust to a thick, clinging mud. The ride to his ranch was long and treacherous, the wagon wheels slipping in the mire, the world dissolving into a gray, wind-swept blur. He could feel her beside him, a still, silent presence, and the quiet was different now. It was no longer his solitary fortress. It was a shared space, filled with the unspoken tension of two lives that had collided by cruelest chance. The ranch was even grimmer in the rain. The small, sturdy cabin, the barn, and the corrals looked hunkered down against the storm, isolated and stark against the vast, empty landscape. Inside, the cabin was a monument to a life of function without comfort. A stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table with two chairs, a cot in one corner, and a small, curtained-off alcove for a second bed. It was clean, but it was the sterile cleanliness of a place that was merely inhabited, not lived in. The air was stale, smelling of wood smoke, old leather, and a deep, lingering loneliness. Caleb lit a lantern, the yellow light pushing back the gloom, revealing the dust motes dancing in the air. He expected her to be appalled, to show some sign of dismay at the Spartan reality of her new temporary prison. But May simply took in the room with those same calm, observant eyes. She placed her hands together and gave another slight, formal bow, this time to the room itself. It was an acknowledgment, a sign of respect for the shelter it offered. The gesture was so at odds with his own feelings about the place that it stopped him cold. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them inside. They existed in a fragile, unspoken truce. Caleb tended to his indoor chores, mending tack, sharpening tools, cleaning his rifle, filling the cabin with the familiar masculine smells of oil and leather. May was a quiet shadow, moving with an efficiency that was both unnerving and deeply impressive. She unpacked her trunk, revealing not just more silk dresses, but practical cotton tunics and trousers, along with a small collection of books, brushes, and an inkstone. She swept the floors, wiped down the surfaces, and organized his chaotic pantry, arranging his sacks and tins into neat, sensible rows. She did not ask permission. She simply saw what needed to be done and did it. On the second day, he decided to test her, or perhaps to justify his own frustration with her presence. He tossed a slab of salt pork and a half-empty sack of cornmeal onto the table. It was the kind of meager fare he subsisted on, bland and practical. "Make something," he ordered, the words more of a challenge than a request. He went outside to check on the animals in the barn, deliberately staying away longer than necessary. He imagined he would return to find her staring helplessly at the ingredients, or perhaps a burned, inedible mess in the skillet. When he came back, soaked and cold, a smell met him at the door that made him stop. It was not the familiar, greasy scent of fried pork. It was warm, savory, and complex. On the table were 2 bowls of a thick, steaming porridge, golden yellow and flecked with green. Beside them, thin slices of the salt pork had been pan-fried to a perfect, crisp brown. He looked at her, and she gestured to the bowl. He saw a small tin of spices on the shelf that he had forgotten he even owned, and a handful of wild onions she must have found growing by the door, somehow spotting them in the rain. He sat down and ate. The porridge was creamy, the saltiness of the pork cut by the sharp, fresh bite of the onions and a subtle, warming heat from a spice he couldn't name. It was simple food, made from the most basic ingredients, yet she had transformed it into something more. It was the best meal he had eaten in over a year. He ate every last spoonful, the warmth spreading through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. He looked up at her, ready to offer a grudging word of thanks, but she was already cleaning the skillet, her back to him. The moment passed, but the meal remained, a silent testament to a depth he had not expected. His perception of her began to shift. He started to watch her, not as an intruder but as a puzzle. He saw the way she mended a tear in one of his shirts with stitches so small and perfect they were nearly invisible. He watched her read her books by the firelight, her expression intent, her lips sometimes moving silently. He noticed that despite her delicate appearance, she was not idle. She hauled water from the well, her thin arms surprisingly strong. She learned the rhythms of his life without a word of instruction, having hot coffee ready when he came in from the cold morning air, banking the fire at night so a bed of warm coals greeted him at dawn. She did not fill the silence with chatter. She inhabited it, giving it a different quality. It was no longer empty. It was watchful. The grudging respect grew, a slow, creeping vine. He found himself moving more quietly in the small space, taking care not to disturb her. He started leaving a small bowl of fresh water on the table for her inkstone without thinking about it. These were small, unconscious acts of accommodation, cracks appearing in the walls of his fortress. He was still counting the days until the stagecoach returned, but the desperation to be rid of her had begun to fade, replaced by a reluctant and deeply unsettling curiosity. He had thought her a fragile doll, a liability. He was beginning to understand she was made of something far stronger than silk. She was made of tempered steel. On the morning the storm finally broke, the world was scrubbed clean. The air was crisp and cool, the sky a brilliant, aching blue, and the valley floor was alive with the gurgle of rain-swollen creeks. The sense of peace was a fragile illusion. As Caleb was checking the fences along his property line, he saw them coming. 3 riders, moving with the arrogant assurance of men who believed the land already belonged to them. At their head was Silas Blackwood. Blackwood was a man whose ambition had rotted him from the inside out. He was handsome in a cruel, sharp-edged way, with pale eyes that missed nothing and a smile that never reached them. He had come to the valley 2 years prior with a fat wallet and a lawyer's understanding of how to use water rights as a weapon. He had bought up the main river, dammed it, and was now slowly strangling every small rancher downstream, forcing them to sell their parched lands to him for pennies on the dollar. Caleb's ranch was one of the last holdouts, blessed with a small, year-round creek that flowed from the high mountains, independent of Blackwood's river. It made his land the jewel of the valley, and Blackwood coveted it with a single-minded hunger. They stopped their horses just shy of the fence line, a deliberate act of trespass. Blackwood's gaze swept over the ranch, lingering on the healthy green of the pasture near the creek, a stark contrast to the browning fields of Caleb's neighbors. His eyes were full of a cold, proprietary greed. "Halt," Blackwood said, his voice smooth and pleasant, a sound more menacing than any shout. "Enjoying the rain?" Caleb said nothing. He leaned against a fence post, his hand resting near the axe handle tucked into his belt. His posture was relaxed, but every muscle was coiled tight. Blackwood's smile widened. "I've come to repeat my offer. A generous one, considering your circumstances. It's a hard life for one man alone." His gaze flickered toward the cabin, and at that moment, May stepped out onto the small porch, a basket of laundry in her hands. She stopped when she saw the riders, her stillness a stark contrast to the nervous energy of the horses. Blackwood's eyes widened in genuine surprise, then his smile turned into a sneer. He looked from May back to Caleb, his expression a vile mixture of amusement and contempt. Well, I see you've found yourself some company. Didn't take you for the type, Holt. Importing your comforts all the way from the Orient." The casual cruelty of the words, the way he dismissed her as a mere object, ignited a cold, hard rage in Caleb's chest. It was a feeling he hadn't experienced in years, a sharp, protective instinct that caught him completely off guard. It wasn't just about his land anymore. This man, with his soft hands and rotten soul, was a threat to the quiet order this woman had brought into his home. "This is my land, Blackwood," Caleb said, his voice low and steady, a dangerous rumble. "You're not welcome on it." "Your land?" Blackwood laughed, a short, ugly sound. "For now. But that little creek of yours, accidents happen, springs dry up. It would be a shame to see all this hard work turn to dust." He paused, letting the threat hang in the clean morning air. "I'll give you until the end of the week. Take my offer, or you'll have nothing left to sell but bones and dirt." He wheeled his horse around, his two hired men following suit, their smug laughter drifting back as they rode away. The threat was no longer veiled. It was a promise. Caleb watched them go, his hand clenched so tightly on the axe handle his knuckles were white. He turned and looked toward the cabin. May was still standing on the porch, the laundry basket forgotten at her feet. She was watching him, her dark eyes holding his across the distance. In her gaze, he saw not fear, but a shared understanding. The threat had not just been against him or his land. It had been against them. And in that moment, the fragile truce of strangers cohabiting a space became something else entirely. It became an alliance. The peace that followed the storm lasted less than 2 days. On the third morning, Caleb awoke to a change in the silence. The familiar, cheerful song of the creek that ran beside his cabin was gone. In its place was a dead quiet. He threw on his boots and ran outside. The creek bed, which should have been full and rushing with snowmelt and rainwater, was nothing more than a ribbon of damp, dark earth and glistening stones. The water was gone. A sick, cold dread settled in his stomach. Blackwood hadn't waited. He had acted. He followed the dry creek bed upstream, his boots sinking into the soft mud. A mile into the hills that marked the edge of his property, he found it. A crude but effective dam, built of felled trees, rocks, and packed earth, stretched across the narrow gorge from which the creek emerged. The water was already pooling behind it, a growing reservoir that Blackwood would undoubtedly divert to his own lands. It was a death sentence. Without that water, his cattle would die, his pasture would wither, and his ranch would become another worthless, dusty plot for Blackwood to absorb. The rage from before returned, hotter and sharper now, but it was tempered by a chilling sense of helplessness. Blackwood had an army of men. Caleb was one man. He returned to the cabin as the sun climbed higher, the heat already starting to bake the moisture from the air. May was waiting on the porch. She must have seen the look on his face, the grim set of his jaw, because she didn't ask what was wrong. She simply watched him, her hands clasped in front of her. "He damned the creek," Caleb said, the words tasting like ash. "Up in the gorge." He paced the length of the cabin, the trapped energy of his fury making the small space feel like a cage. His mind raced through impossible scenarios. Going to the sheriff was useless. The lawman was a weary, underpaid official who was firmly in Blackwood's pocket. A direct confrontation was suicide. He was outnumbered and outgunned. His only hope was to undo what Blackwood had done, to destroy the dam himself. But it would have to be at night, and it would have to be done quickly and quietly. "I'll have to use dynamite," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Got a few sticks left from clearing the north pasture. One well-placed charge should be enough to breach it." He began to gather his tools, his movements sharp and jerky. He laid out the sticks of dynamite, the blasting caps, and the fuses on the table. His plan was simple, brutal, and full of risk. He would go in under the cover of a moonless night, plant the charge, and get out before Blackwood's men, who were undoubtedly guarding the dam, knew he was there. May came and stood beside the table, her gaze falling on the dangerous materials. She looked at the crude map of the gorge he had scratched onto a piece of wood. She was silent for a long time, her eyes tracing the lines of the terrain, her brow furrowed in concentration. Caleb was too consumed by his own desperate planning to pay her much mind until she spoke. "The charge is too loud," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "They will be on you before the water is through." Caleb stopped, turning to look at her. "It's the only way. It has to be fast." "There is another way," she said. She picked up a piece of charcoal and, on a clean section of the table, began to draw. Her movements were swift and precise. She drew the dam, the gorge, the pool in water. "My father was an engineer," she explained, her eyes never leaving her drawing. "He built canals and levees on a great river in my homeland. He taught me that water has its own power. You do not need to fight the whole structure. You only need to show the water the way out." She pointed to the base of the dam on his crude map. "Here," she said, tapping the spot. "The pressure is greatest at the bottom. The earth will be softest. You do not need a loud explosion. You need to dig. Create a small channel, a weakness. Pack it with a small charge, just enough to break the seal. The water itself will do the rest. It will tear the dam apart from the inside out. It will be slower but quieter. By the time they realize what is happening, the flood will be unstoppable." Caleb stared at her drawing, then back at his own map. He saw the simple, devastating logic in her words. His plan was a frontal assault. Hers was a subtle, tactical masterpiece. She had seen the problem not as a wall to be broken, but as a system to be turned against itself. He had underestimated her again, and the realization humbled him. She was not just a woman with hidden domestic skills. She possessed a keen, analytical mind that saw things he, in his blind rage, had completely missed. "I will go with you," she stated, looking up at him. It was not an offer. It was a fact. "No," he said instantly. "It's too dangerous." "You will need a lookout," she countered, her voice calm and unshakable. "Someone to watch the guards while you work. I am small, and I am quiet. You will not even know I am there." He looked into her eyes and saw a resolve that matched his own. She was right. Working alone, he would be blind. He would be walking into a trap. With her watching his back, his chances improved tenfold. The idea of putting her in danger churned his gut, but the alternative, losing everything, was worse. The partnership that had been forged in the silence of the cabin was about to be tested by darkness and violence. He gave a single, sharp nod. The decision was made. They would face Blackwood together. The night was as black as the inside of a tomb. A sliver of moon offered no comfort, hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The air was still and heavy, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Caleb moved through the darkness with the practiced ease of a predator, his steps silent on the carpet of fallen needles. Behind him, May followed, a weightless shadow he could feel more than see or hear. She moved with a startling grace, her small frame navigating the treacherous rock-strewn terrain without a single misstep or snapped twig. She carried a small pack with water and a spyglass her father had given her, while Caleb bore the heavier load: a shovel, a crowbar, and 2 carefully wrapped sticks of dynamite, far less than his original plan required. They stopped at the ridge overlooking the gorge. Below, the dam was a dark, hulking shape against the faint starlight reflecting off the unnaturally still water behind it. A single campfire burned near the far side, a flickering orange eye in the oppressive darkness. 2 of Blackwood's men were silhouetted against the flames, their postures relaxed, their voices carrying faintly on the night air. They were confident, lazy in their watch. "I will be on that rise," May whispered, her voice a bare breath of sound beside his ear. She pointed to a cluster of rocks to their left, a perfect vantage point that offered a clear view of the camp and the trail leading to it. "If they move, I will make the call of a nighthawk, twice." Caleb nodded, his throat too tight for words. He watched her melt into the shadows, and for a terrifying moment he was alone again. He took a deep breath, the cold air stinging his lungs, and began his descent into the gorge, moving parallel to the creek bed to mask any sound he might make. The work was brutal and slow. The earth at the base of the dam was wet and heavy, a thick, sucking clay that fought him for every shovelful. He worked with a desperate, focused intensity, his muscles screaming in protest. Every scrape of the shovel against a rock sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes. He was exposed, vulnerable, his back to the enemy. His entire existence depended on the eyes of the woman watching from the rocks above. He dug for what felt like an eternity, carving a narrow tunnel into the base of the earthen wall. Just as he was preparing to place the small charge, he heard it. The cry of a night hawk, sharp and clear. And then, a second time. His blood ran cold. He froze, every nerve ending screaming. He flattened himself against the muddy face of the dam, trying to will himself invisible. He heard the crunch of boots on gravel. One of the guards was making a round. Caleb held his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The footsteps grew closer, paused directly above him on the top of the dam, and then, after an agonizing moment, receded. He waited, counting to 100 before he dared to move again. He worked with frantic haste now, setting the small charge, running the short fuse. He lit it, the hiss of the burning powder deafeningly loud to his own ears, and scrambled back up the side of the gorge, his lungs burning, his legs shaking with adrenaline. He reached the ridge just as a dull, muffled thump echoed from below. It was less an explosion and more a deep, subterranean cough. For a moment, nothing happened. He thought, with a surge of despair, that it had failed. Then he saw it, a dark trickle of water seeping from the base of the dam. The trickle became a stream, then a torrent. The water, freed, began to claw at the weakened structure. A low groan vibrated through the earth as the packed logs and rocks began to shift. With a sound like a giant sigh, a whole section of the dam gave way, and the full, pent-up force of the creek was unleashed in a roaring, churning wave of white water. It tore the rest of the dam apart, as if it were made of twigs, the sound of snapping timber and crashing rock filling the night. They had done it. A triumphant grin split Caleb's face. He turned, searching the darkness for May. He found her standing not far away, the spyglass still held to her eyes, but she was not looking at the destroyed dam. She was looking back toward the ranch. "They're not at the camp," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "They were never at the camp. It was a decoy. They are at the house." The triumph vanished, replaced by a dread so cold it felt like ice in his veins. The dam wasn't the prize, it was the bait. Blackwood had played him perfectly, drawing him out, leaving his home and her defenseless. Except she wasn't at the house. She was here. Blackwood's plan had a fatal flaw. He had underestimated them both. Gunshots cracked from the direction of the ranch, sharp and angry in the night. Blackwood and his men, realizing the trick, were venting their fury on his home. Caleb broke into a run, crashing through the undergrowth with a reckless desperation. May was right behind him, keeping pace with an agility that defied her slight build. As they cleared the last line of trees, they saw it. The cabin was dark, but 4 figures on horseback were circling it, firing into the windows. At their head, Caleb could just make out the silhouette of Silas Blackwood. Caleb raised his rifle, but the range was too great, the targets moving too erratically in the dark. He needed to get closer, to draw them away from the cabin. He was about to break cover when May put a hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she whispered, her eyes gleaming in the dark. "He thinks the house is the target. He is wrong. We are the target." Before he could process her words, she slipped away from his side. She moved to a large granite boulder that offered a solid, defensible position. From the small pack on her back, she did not pull out water or food. She pulled out a pistol. It was a Colt Peacemaker, but smaller, with an ivory grip. A lady's model he had seen in her trunk and dismissed as a useless trinket. She checked the load with a calm, practiced efficiency that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Draw their fire," she said, her voice devoid of any tremor. "I will finish it." He didn't have time to question the sheer stunning impossibility of what he was seeing. He trusted his gut, and his gut told him to trust her. He moved to the opposite side of the clearing, took a deep breath, and fired his rifle into the air. The shot ripped through the night, and immediately the riders wheeled their horses toward the sound. "He's over there!" Blackwood yelled. "Get him!" 2 of the riders broke off, charging straight for Caleb's position. He ducked behind a thick pine, levering another round into the chamber. A bullet splintered the bark next to his head. He fired back, aiming for the horses, trying to unseat them. And then, From the other side of the clearing came a series of sharp, precise cracks, faster than any man could fire a rifle. One of the charging riders cried out and tumbled from his saddle. The second horse screamed and reared, its rider fighting for control, just as another shot rang out, and he too fell. It was over in seconds. Blackwood and his remaining man reined in, confused, searching the darkness for this new invisible threat. Caleb seized the opportunity. He stepped out from behind the tree and took careful aim. He fired, and the last of Blackwood's men slumped over his horse. Now it was just Blackwood. He sat on his horse in the middle of the clearing, a dark shape of pure malice trapped between 2 points of fire. "Show yourself," Blackwood roared, his voice raw with fury and a newfound threat of fear. Caleb stepped into the faint moonlight. At the same moment, from behind the granite boulder, May rose to her feet. She held the pistol in a two-handed grip, her stance perfectly balanced, her aim unwavering. The sight of her, this small, silk-clad woman holding a gun with the confidence of a seasoned shootist, was so utterly confounding that Blackwood could only stare. In that moment of stunned silence, Caleb saw the full truth. The tactical mind, the quiet resilience, the impossible speed with the gun. She was not the daughter of a simple engineer. She was something more, someone more, but there was no time for questions. Blackwood recovered, his face contorting in a snarl of rage. He raised his own pistol, aiming it not at Caleb, but at May. He never fired the shot. 2 guns went off at almost the exact same instant. Caleb's rifle bucked against his shoulder. May's pistol spat a single tongue of flame. Blackwood was thrown from his saddle as if struck by lightning, landing in a heap in the dust. Silence descended, absolute and profound. The only sounds were the panicked breathing of the horses and the distant, triumphant roar of the newly freed creek. The fight was over. Caleb walked slowly into the clearing, his rifle held ready, but there was no need. Blackwood was still. He looked over at May. She was lowering the pistol, her hands finely trembling, the aftermath of the violence hitting her. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes huge and dark. He crossed the space between them and stopped in front of her. He reached out, not to take the gun, but to check her for injuries. His hand brushed her arm, and he saw a dark stain spreading on her crimson sleeve. She had been hit. A stray shot, a piece of shrapnel from a ricochet, he didn't know. "You're hurt," he said, his voice rough with a storm of emotions he couldn't name. She looked down at her arm as if noticing it for the first time. "It is nothing," she whispered. It was not nothing. He gently took her arm, tearing the silk sleeve to get a better look at the wound. It was a deep graze, bleeding freely. Without a word, he tore a strip from his own shirt and began to bandage it, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle. They stood there in the quiet aftermath of the battle, surrounded by the wreckage of Blackwood's greed, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and blood. He finished tying the knot, his fingers lingering on her arm for a moment longer than necessary. He looked up and met her eyes. In their depths, he saw not the hardened killer he had just witnessed, but a profound weariness and a vulnerability she had kept hidden behind a wall of quiet dignity. All the questions he had, all the mysteries about her past, faded into irrelevance. All that mattered was that she was here, and she was safe. The wall around his heart, the fortress he had so carefully constructed, did not just have cracks in it anymore. It had crumbled into dust. In the weeks that followed, a new kind of quiet settled over the ranch. It was not the empty silence of solitude, nor the tense silence of strangers. It was a comfortable, living quiet, filled with the sounds of recovery and rebuilding. The creek flowed strong and clear, a constant, soothing murmur that promised life. The bullet holes in the cabin walls were patched, the broken windows replaced. Caleb's own minor injuries healed, as did the graze on May's arm, leaving a pale, thin scar on her skin that he sometimes found his eyes drawn to. The sheriff, roused by a nervous telegraph from Miller, the storekeeper who had heard the distant gunfight, had eventually ridden out. He had looked at the scene, listened to Caleb's clipped, factual account, and declared it a clear case of self-defense. Blackwood's empire, built on intimidation, crumbled without him. The valley began to breathe again. Caleb and May fell into a new rhythm, one of partnership. They worked side by side, rarely needing words to understand one another. He would be mending a fence, and she would appear with a canteen of cool water before he even realized he was thirsty. She would be struggling to move a heavy sack of feed in the barn, and he would come and lift it for her as if it weighed nothing. He learned the story of her past in small pieces, not because he asked, but because she chose to share it. Her father had been a military advisor to a provincial governor, a man of intellect and principle who had fallen out of favor. He had taught her strategy with game boards and self-defense with a pistol, insisting that a woman's mind and her hands must both be sharp to survive in a world of men. Her marriage to Ethan had been her father's last, desperate attempt to send her to a place of safety, far away from his political enemies. She had not been a bride seeking a husband, but a refugee seeking sanctuary. One afternoon, they worked together in the small patch of earth beside the cabin, turning the soil for a garden. It had been her idea. She wanted to grow herbs and vegetables, things that would turn his bland, functional meals into something more. He dug the hard earth with a shovel, and she followed behind, breaking up the clods of dirt with a small trowel, her hands, no longer pristine, covered in the rich, dark soil. The sun was warm on their backs, and the air was sweet with the scent of pine and wet earth. He watched her as she carefully planted a row of seeds, her expression one of deep, peaceful concentration. He realized, with a clarity that was both startling and profoundly simple, that he could not imagine this place without her. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home. The land was no longer just a place to hide. It was a future. A few days later, he rode into town for supplies. Prosperity felt different, or maybe he was the one who had changed. The stares he received were no longer just curious. They were tinged with a new respect. He was the man who had faced down Silas Blackwood and won. As he was leaving the general store, something in the window caught his eye. It was her crimson silk dress, the one she had arrived in, cleaned and pressed and hung on a mannequin. It looked as out of place in the dusty store window as she had on the street that first day. He went back inside. "The dress," he said to Miller. "Why do you have it?" Miller wrung his hands, looking uncomfortable. She came in, a few weeks back, right after Blackwood cut your water. Said she needed flour and seed. Didn't have coin. She offered the dress as trade." He gestured to a sack of flour and a small bag of seeds on a nearby shelf. "That's what I gave her for it." Caleb stared at the sack of flour. He remembered that time, the desperation he had felt, the fear that they would lose everything. While he had been consumed with his own rage and planning, she had been quietly preparing to make the ultimate sacrifice, trading the last beautiful thing she owned, her only link to her past and the symbol of her lost future, for the simple, practical means of their survival. She had been ready to give up her identity for a bag of flour, for him. He pulled a worn leather pouch from his pocket and emptied a handful of coins onto the counter, far more than the dress or the flower were worth. "I'll take the dress," he said, his voice thick, "and the flower and seed she traded for. All of it." He rode home with the dress carefully wrapped in oilcloth and tied behind his saddle. When he arrived, May was on the porch, mending a shirt. She looked up as he approached, a small, welcoming smile on her face. He dismounted and walked up the steps, holding the bundle. He didn't know what to say, how to explain the enormity of what he felt. Words were clumsy, inadequate tools for the landscape of his heart. He simply held out the package to her. She took it, her brow furrowing in confusion. She unwrapped the oilcloth, and her breath caught when she saw the crimson silk. Her hands trembled slightly as she touched the familiar fabric. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears, full of questions. He cleared his throat, the words coming out rough and uneven. "It belongs here," he said, his gaze steady and unwavering. "With you." It was all he could say, but it was enough. It meant you belong here. It meant this is your home. It meant I want you to stay. She understood. She didn't speak. She simply rose to her feet, clutching the dress to her chest, and stepped forward, closing the small space between them. She rested her head against his shirt, and he wrapped his arms around her, holding her tight. They stood there on the porch of the small cabin as the sun began to set, painting the sky in the hues of orange and rose. The fortress was gone, and in its place he had found something he never knew he was searching for: a partner, a home, a reason.